keep losing in arguments and losing in the real world. So it's been beaten back so far that now you're basically just saying, it's worker co-ops that are managed by the workers. This is like science beating back religion.
Round 1, fight!
All right, the Stephen Bennell versus Richard Wolff debate. I'm going to skip past their opening statements, and we're going to dive right into it.
I find this a laughable caricature of anything I've ever written or anything that I understand is part of this conversation. And I don't appreciate being told what I think or what I say or what I mean or what I intend. I can speak for myself, and that would just be fine if we could allow each other to do that. Number one. Number two, I have no idea what this silly remark that I hear so often is, that no socialist society has succeeded at anything. I have no idea what you're talking about. Let me give you an example. One of the most important metrics used in the economics profession around the world to assess the quote-unquote success of an economic system is the rate of economic growth. You measure GDP and you look at how it grows over time. And then you compare one country to another to assess their relative success, not as societies, because that's a vague generality, but at this particular metric which we use in economics to measure economic growth over time. It's not the only metric, but it's a widely used one. So I'm now going to use it. In the 20th century, the fastest growing metric, the fastest growing GDP in any country measured was the Soviet Union. And in the 21st century we're living in, the fastest growing GDP in the world has been the People's Republic of China. This is not...
First and foremost, roughly in about 1989, 1990, China becomes state capitalist. It is not a communist or a socialist country. And much of their economic growth has really ramped up just in the last 20 years, when loads and loads of capitalist investment, capitalist foreign nations pouring money into China. Now, Richard Wolff later will go on to say that's because they had a strong foundation and that's why the capitalists wanted to come in. Perhaps, yeah. Perhaps that can actually be a reason that they wanted to come in. But much of the rapid growth to get them to where they are today and to make it such a desirable place to continue more capitalists coming in is the last 25 years or so, with a lot of capitalist moves from foreign capitalists all over the world.
Not an endorsement of one or another economic system. It's a statement of fact verified by any reliable source of information. The UN, the projects in the University of California, Berkeley, and others who keep track of this. So this has to be understood, because in much of the world, economic growth is a shared objective and goal that these two societies have excelled at achieving. Number one. Number two, when it comes to socialism, it would be useful if we all understood what the word means rather than playing around with caricatures. For example, the notion that socialism is all about what the government does has been contested throughout the history of socialism. And that idea is less dominant within the socialist tradition now than it ever was over the last 150 years. For example, today, one of the most important issues for socialists has to do not with government regulation, not with government owning and operating businesses, not with these bugaboos of bureaucracy and all the rest of it, but it has to do with an objective of transforming the organization of production in a factory, in an office, in a store. Not to have a small group of people, the owner, the board of directors, the tiny little minority at the top that is a dictatorial power inside an enterprise, making all the key decisions that the employees have to live with, even though the minority making those decisions is not accountable to those employees. That's a socialism of transformation at the micro level, about which very little could have been discerned in the comments preceding these. If we're going to talk about socialism, then we have to talk about what it means to the people pushing for it and urging it. And those people have learned from the 20th and 21st century, just like those who pushed for capitalism 3 centuries ago learned from their early experiments how to refine, how to adjust, and how to change. To pretend that that didn't happen, to trade in old and shrinking conceptions of socialism, may be good debating ploy, but it doesn't advance our understanding of anything.
Okay, if you want to be easier to have more of a back and forth rather than the super long monologues, so we can respond to more, if you're okay with that. Just for a couple of things that you said. So I'm trying not to miss...
I just talk slower than you.
Oh, yeah, no, it's fine, it's fine. My understanding is that in the 20th century, there was a faster growing economy than the USSR, and it was Japan. Japan still exists today, and the USSR does not. I understand that the USSR did show a huge amount of growth, but I think it's odd to use that as an example when socialists often point to the evils of imperialism, and when you point out the fact that everybody was heavily industrializing around that time as well. I don't think it's fair to say that the USSR simply grew on the merits of socialism when there were so many other things happening at the time, and when it was outgrown by another economy that was...
But those are the facts. I mean, you can play whatever games you want. The fact of the matter is that the Soviet Union's performance in the 20th century completely outshines that of Japan. There's no comparison. In 1917, when the Soviet Union begins, it is the poorest country in Europe by far. It then goes through 70 years of a lost World War I, of a civil war, of an agricultural collectivization, and of World War II, which did more damage in Russia than in any other country. Notwithstanding that it was the poorest country at the beginning of this horrific story, it ends up in 1965 being the #1 competitor of the United States for global hegemony. That's only because of its #1 status in economic growth that it achieved the overcoming of all those horrific losses. I'm not arguing in favor of this or that about the Soviet.
This is kind kind of a waste of time to get into how much can you attribute socialism to the growth of the USSR, how much can you attribute capitalism to the growth of Japan, and they kind of get bogged down in that, and you don't really know. It's very hard to answer that question. He is correct that the USSR is the fastest growing nation through the 20th century, or economy, I should say. But the thing he throws in there is it becomes the global competitor for hegemony with the United States. Well, yeah, but you could also just attribute that to the fact that after World War II, it was the only country that is technically on the winning side of World War II that is still a rival of the United States. So yeah, of course, it's the only country after World War II that is a rival of the United States. So of course that they're rivaling the United States for global hegemony. Japan got 2 nukes dropped on them. They were a rival of the United States and an opponent during World War II. All the other countries that technically won World War II were allies of the United States. So that only leaves Russia to rival the United States for hegemony on the global stage. They're the only one that could. They're the only one that technically won World War II, but is also still a rival of the United States.
Union. But the fact of its achievement is a staggering reality that you can dance around from here to tomorrow, but it doesn't go away because it's inconvenient to confront it. And the same thing is true now. If you read Pro Buck's novels about China before the revolution, you will hear about a society whose depth of poverty literally blows your mind. And here they are, about to surpass the United States before the end of this decade. And that was accomplished by a communist revolution and a government that has been run by a communist party to this day. And yeah, for sure, they cleverly opened their society up.
He slips that in there too. Yeah, they were run before by a communist party. They're not so communist anymore. Again, they're state capitalist. But again, you can be a socialist, and advocate for socialist programs, but not actually live in socialism. Does that make sense? Like, you can be a socialist, but it doesn't mean that you're operating within socialism. It's the same thing with over the last 3 decades or 25 years of China. They may claim to be the Communist Party of China. They're more state capitalist, 1, and 2, they can claim or say they're communist, but they're actually operating within a state capitalist system, which by and large is the reason that they are the economic power that they've become.
To capitalists to come and join them, but to imagine that the achievement of the Chinese economy is purely due to the private capitalists rather than to the state economy, that's making believe, because you need to have an argument that puts the success at the credit of one or the other. The infrastructure, the training of the mass of people, everything that happened in China is as much a product of the planning and policies of the communist government than of any other factor. And that has to be recognized as well. And none of this is an endorsement. That society has strengths and weaknesses. It has things we can criticize. But we can't make it up because it's inconvenient to face the successes they've had and continue to have.
Okay, so I'm not saying that the USSR did not grow a lot. Obviously, the USSR grew massively. Your claim is not that the USSR grew. That's not what we're arguing about. It's whether or not the USSR grew at the rate that it did due to socialism. A country that was heavily involved in multiple famines, a country that heavily went from little industrialization to a lot of industrialization, and a country that engaged in a lot of imperialistic practices is a country that grew massively in the 20th century. To say that all of their growth, or even the majority of their growth, was due to the organization of their economy and not due to factors that were independent of that organization, to say otherwise that they wouldn't have grown maybe at an even faster rate had they been a capitalist economy, there would have to be some evidence provided for that. I don't believe that that's ever been adequately demonstrated. On the contrary, I believe some people argue that Russia could have potentially grown, the USSR could have potentially grown even faster had it abandoned some of its more outdated forms of trying to manage their economy. When we bring up China, China has grown a lot under certain socialist policies for sure. When we look at China, especially in the 80s and 90s, China began opening itself up to massive growth when it comes to foreign investment. China is the number 2 country in the world that allows for foreign direct investment. And the coalescing of all of China's state-owned, the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, into a select few industries, and then the massive opening of foreign investment into that country to give other people more control over privately owned businesses has been what has caused the massive explosion that we've seen of China in terms of pulling people out of global poverty, as you mentioned in the video that you did for the Gravel Institute. You attribute that to socialist policies, but the thing that really pulled China into the 21st century in terms of economic success was the opening itself up to foreign direct investment, was the opening itself up to other economies being able to interact with them more, which are all neoliberal trade policies. These aren't people-owned businesses. These aren't businesses that are ran by the workers. These are, I mean, if anything, China is a government that runs the business itself. It's a state capitalist economy more so than any type of socialist or communist economy. To say that a single party regime is having the workers themselves making decisions over how any individual business is running, I don't think it's fair to say. I guess real quick, just finishing.
Your understanding of China, is really badly flawed.
Can I finish this?
It's really not. His understanding of China is actually not that badly flawed. It's pretty much what is going on in China. So we're gonna have to score one for Destiny there. But again, back to what I said before, it's kind of like it's hard to know and attribute how much you can point towards this was socialism that got them their feet on the ground and wanted to make the capitalists come in and inflow their money into China. It's hard to know all this, and it's very hard to quantify and to wholeheartedly say this was because of socialism, this was because of capitalism. But like Destiny said, his argument is how much of it is due to socialism, which is like, it's just very hard to quantify. So they're both kind of just, wasting time here, really.
This last part, the thing that confuses me the most, and the thing that frustrates me the most, I guess, when I have discussions with socialists, is socialism feels like this very amorphous, ever-transforming idea of what it actually is, such that I don't even know why we use the word anymore. So I'm very glad that you've acknowledged that Marx, in through his labor theory value analysis, was absolutely flawed and was an absolute failure. I'm glad that you've acknowledged that the way of analyzing.
I have not acknowledged you're making this stuff up. I've never acknowledged anything of the work.
Okay, well,
I don't even know where you get this.
Well, earlier you just said that we shouldn't hold ourselves captive to the thinking of thinkers in the 19th century in terms of what socialism is. So I assume you've evolved.
No, I didn't do that at all. I told you that socialism has a variety of theories within it. It's a broad tradition. It had to be. In the 150 years since Marx wrote, his ideas have moved into every country on this earth at different levels of economic and cultural and political life. And of course, those different people all found something valuable, but they all made their own interpretations. This is a rich, diverse tradition. It's as if you're going to decide what it is I mean when I say these things. I never said that the Marxist theory isn't valuable, that the labor theory of value doesn't apply. If you read any of the books and articles.
Okay, so this is where Richard Wolff is correct. He don't recall him ever saying that, and Destiny kind of just made an assumption there because of something he said about not, being beholden or listening to thinkers of the 19th century, and Destiny kind of just assumed that. So Richard Wolff didn't actually say that, so there's a score point for Richard Wolff there, but the labor theory of value is trash and shouldn't be listened to, as a footnote.
I've pumped out in my life, that the exact opposite is the case.
When you say
something, wait a minute, I want to correct something about China because you keep repeating it. Okay. You know why private enterprise and private capital flows into China in the 80s and 90s? Because China had transformed itself from a place where nobody wanted to invest to a place like now where everybody does. Capitalist enterprises went there because they had a well-educated, disciplined labor force
That has nothing to do with whether or not China is socialist at all, what he's saying. And two, even if that is the case, it's still also the case that the massive growth they're seeing is because the capitalists went there and started investing heavily, and China allowed it.
Very low wages because they had built an extraordinary infrastructure. Because you had a growing level of income for people to buy things. That's why General Motors produces and sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. The reason private capital went there was because they had, before the arrival, created the institutions. Every other part of the so-called third world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, who had received since the Second World War massive amounts of foreign aid, were desperately trying to do what the Chinese were doing, namely develop their country so that foreign private investment would come. China didn't get any foreign aid because they were communists and the United States didn't give them any. But they did a better job than all the countries who did get it in order to get to the point of economic development where it became interesting for capitalists in Japan and Europe to go there. You need to pretend, for reasons I do not understand, that all of the achievements I've just described didn't happen, that somehow they don't deserve the credit. Look, in the world of economics, perhaps you're not familiar, we do exactly what you just said we oughtn't to do. We look at societies and say, they have a capitalist economic system, how did they do? And they have a socialist system with the different meanings of that term, and how did they do? And then we say they're different, and part, not all, part of the story is the different system. And if I say to you that the socialist tradition has multiple interpretations, let me assure you that the capitalist tradition does as well. The leaders of Saudi Arabia right now call themselves capitalists.
Can I ask you, when you say socialist, what do you mean when you say socialist? I'm trying to understand what this means. Can you give me
So again, they're just arguing over how much can be attributed to socialism versus how much can be attributed to capitalism, and that is extremely hard to quantify.
Cohesive, coherent.
That's good. No, let me answer. There are a variety. I'll give you three basic strains right now. They don't exhaust it, but they enable us to have a conversation. One strain, you leave enterprises in the hands of private capitalists, but you recognize that capitalist system is so flawed, for example, in terms of inequality, in terms of business cycle instability, that you give a role to the government of massive intervention, rules, regulations, laws. Let me give you some examples. In France, it's the law that once you begin working after graduating from high school or college, every employer has to give you 5 weeks of paid vacation from the beginning. Nothing like that exists in the United States. But this is a society that won that for its people, by the way, by socialists who did that, and put that on the books, as it is on most European countries. And socialists do that because they believe for them that socialism is when the government comes in and regulates. That's one kind. Here's a second kind. These second kind of socialists, they don't believe it works real well if you do that. It's not enough. So they want to take a different step. They want the government to come in and actually own and operate enterprises, not merely regulate them with rules and laws. Then there's a third kind, which I stressed a few moments ago, which is not about the government. Doesn't care all that much whether the government runs an enterprise or the private does. They can figure out whichever one works better. Let's be real practical. But for them, what socialism means is the transformation of the everyday life of working people. No longer do you go to work with other people telling you what to do, where to sit, what machine to use, what raw material to work on. And at the end of the day, you go home and you've got nothing more to say about what you bored your brains and muscles into. No, no, no. For these socialists, like me, the crucial thing is to reorganize the workplace, to bring real democracy, can you believe it, to the place where we work. In a country that claims to be democratic, we don't have democracy in the workplace. We have a tiny group of people.
Okay, so he gives them three definitions. The first one is really just capitalism. It's just capitalism with some regulations. So it's really not a socialism at all. Second one, he gets to socialism, where it's the actual ownership of the means of production, which is like the traditional definition of socialism. And then the last one, which is basically like worker cooperatives, because he says like me right there. So he gives them a third. In the third one, if you pay attention there, he gives him the definition, and then Richard says like me, letting us know that this is his definition of socialism.
For these socialists like me,
you know, to throw out all these different definitions, and then he later on says, oh, there's even more definitions of socialism. This is just, I mean, how can we have one of the key things you have to do when you sit down and have a debate is you have to define each other's terms, so you don't end up talking past each other, so you don't end up arguing against something that the other person's not defending because you think the definition of a certain word is one way, but they're operating on a different definition. And if you're going to sit there and say that, oh, these are three definitions and there are numerous other definitions of socialism, like this is just, it's impossible. It makes it so much more difficult for Destiny to pin him down on any one actual definition, because you're saying that these are three, there are numerous others, and now Destiny has to like argue against 7 different definitions of socialism, which is not possible. But you will notice there that Richard said this like me, meaning that this third definition is what he thinks socialism is. That's his definition. This will come into play further in the future here when Destiny still doesn't actually know what Richard's definition is. But he could have missed that, because Richard could have just said, this is my definition. Instead, as he was rattling off the definition, he said, like me, which is easy to miss. It's easy to miss that. He could have been a little more clear. Destiny definitely missed it, and you'll see in the future here coming up.
Telling the majority what to do, fully unaccountable to that majority. You know, if we really believed in democracy, this kind of socialism argues, we would recognize that that's where adults spend most of their adult life, at work. And if you really believe in democracy, it should have been installed in the workplace. But capitalism doesn't permit that. The folks at the top want to keep the power, to keep their inordinate wealth, even at the expense of no democracy and of a growth record inferior to what Russia did in the 20th century and what China is doing now. And that's an enormous price to pay.
Okay, so if you want to talk about the 2 and 3 definitions of socialism, that would be interesting to me, but I only heard 2 definitions of socialism. Number one is just capitalism. I don't know when this like redefining happened of taking capitalism plus government intervention and calling it. Wait, let me finish. Right, I don't know why this was the case that state intervention into private markets to have some form of regulation or some form of socialized healthcare or giving workers 5 weeks off became socialism. It's clearly not socialism. It's so not socialism that I think Marx himself even said that the state would be heavily required in maintaining capitalism, more so than I guess even Marx was able to.
It's not socialism, and if you're going to say that that is socialism, then there is no socialism. Then it's everywhere. I should say, if you're going to say that that is socialism, then everything is socialism. then anything short of just flat out like anarcho-capitalism is socialism, if you're going to operate on that definition.
Because he predicted a revolution of the proletariat in his lifetime. The idea that the state intervening and providing some sort of social welfare or safety net is that's just strictly a capitalist system with some government intervention. If we want to talk about the concept of the government owning and operating enterprises, or number 3, the idea is that the workers themselves have some like worker managed thing, I would be interested in discussing either of those 2 options, as I believe all 5 questions I laid out initially apply to them. But for number 1, I guess I wholly reject that as a form of as a form of socialism. If you believe it is, I'd be curious if you can tell me what is the difference between the first thing you laid out and any capitalist that acknowledges that some level of government intervention is necessary and keeping the economy going.
I'd be glad to explain it to you. The history of socialism gets going in the middle of the 19th century. And at that time, socialists began to argue that capitalism was over, capitalism was done, and a better system was available and should be pursued. And they had a whole bunch of ideas about that. They were a relatively small group. If you know the history of Marx and Marxism, it begins relatively small. As the 19th century progresses, it gets larger and larger. And guess what happens when that movement gets larger? Debates begin to happen inside of it as to what in the world capitalism is and what in the world socialism is. And here we go. Some of the people decided that socialism as a radically alternative system wasn't in the cards. Could never happen in some views, could only happen in a distant future. Well, what then did socialists do in the meanwhile before a real change of system happened? Answer: advocate for the government to be taken over by universal suffrage. The mass of people would institute a socialism that was, if you like, a step in that direction, an early socialism, if you like. And by the way, there were big debates, pro and con, within the socialist movement about this. But they settled to understand, let's call it one kind of socialism. And that's what you have in Western Europe, in Scandinavia, to this day. Socialist parties advocate that, and the people in that society often vote those folks into power. I'll give you an example. The government in Portugal right now, a perfect example, European country. The government of Portugal is a coalition of three political parties. The largest is the Portuguese Socialist Party. The second one is the Portuguese Communist Party. And the third one is the Portuguese Green Party. They were elected as a coalition government in 2016. They were re-elected last year. Parenthetically, if your audience members don't know about this, that's because you live in a society that doesn't tell you about this, even though it's public knowledge to anyone interested in finding out. Those parties push a socialist agenda, by which they mean government rules and regulations. You may not like to call it socialist, but the people involved, and millions of them around the world, do. The other kind of socialism broke away from this first kind in the aftermath of the Soviet Revolution. They were in favor of taking that extra step. Socialism for them meant that the government should take over and operate enterprises, at least the industrial ones, maybe later the agricultural ones. And to underscore their distinction from the other socialists who just wanted government rules, regulations, and controls, they gave themselves the name communist. And that's the only difference between them, and it has been that way for nearly a century now, since the Russian Revolution. And then there's this third one, which has to do with transforming the workplace. Those are all socialisms. They argue, they debate, they have a rich literature. We have lots of empirical examples of all three kinds in the world, and if people want to think about how they work and what kind of society they produce, there's loads of evidence there. We don't have to hypothesize.
It's almost like the American conservatives were right when they say, like, socialism is when the government does things. Socialism is everywhere. Or socialism is the Democratic Party, or Joe Biden is a socialist. This is like, it's almost like he's just proving the American conservatives right, because he's saying that social programs, or socialists pushing for social programs, makes the system that they live in, or country that they live in, socialism. It doesn't. They are socialist, pushing for more social programs, but they still live and operate under a capitalist framework. It's a mixed economy, obviously. But he's just saying that this is socialism. Like, no, they're socialist, advocating for social programs, but that doesn't make their economy as a whole socialism. Otherwise, America is socialism.
Or pretend or demonize either, because really it doesn't lend itself to that if you're serious.
Okay, first of all, just because the government calls itself socialist, I don't think that's adequate to define said government as socialist. Do you agree
Good.
with that?
Give another. Fine. You can have another. That's what the debate is about. Make up your
just one second.
Well,
yeah, okay, so we have to give Destiny a chance to speak as well.
yeah, wait, well, so my question would be, like, in terms of,
have
like,
opportunities
yeah, sure.
to give. Yeah,
I guess,
sure,
like, would you consider, like, for instance, like the Nazi Party? Would you consider that a socialist party, as they have socialism in the name? It doesn't seem like a good.
No. But
why not?
The minute you know anything about the Nazi Party, you'd understand that.
Would you say that is Portugal a socialist economy, or do they have markets? Do they have private investment?
Markets have nothing to do with socialism.
Okay, can you tell me what is your definition of capitalism then? I just, because when I ask you what is socialism to you, I'm like, I understand that you can talk a lot and you can tell me what other people have considered socialism to be, but under your current definitions, for instance, the Democratic. No, you haven't given me your definition. You've told me what other thinkers and what other countries in the past.
See, that's where he says there. He has given him his definition, but he wasn't very clear when he did it, and Destiny must have missed it, because when he rattled off the three definitions of socialism, the third one, when he rattled it off, he said, like me.
For these socialists like me,
meaning this is my definition. He just wasn't very clear in distinguishing it. He could have been a little more lucid. And then Destiny is right. Obviously, the Nazis weren't socialists just because they had the word socialism in their party name. And in the same breath, Portugal is still not a socialist country.
Your definition is not what Portugal does, or it's not what the Portuguese Socialist or Communist parties. You're giving me what other people or other thinkers have thought what socialism is. Because under your current definition, number one, the Democratic Party in the United States would be considered a socialist party because they're in favor of heavy government intervention in terms of climate change or healthcare. And I don't know if would you agree that the Democratic Party in the United States of America is a socialist party, or if they rebranded themselves? Okay, so it's clear then that the naming mechanism alone isn't enough for you, because the Nazi Party obviously called themselves socialists. I don't think many people, me included, would consider themselves socialists. And it's obvious that there must be some outside definition that you're alluding to that when you call something socialist. So I'm just trying to figure out what can you tell me what is capitalism to you? What does it mean when an economy or a society is a capitalist economy? What does that mean to you?
Well, let me answer. I gave you three definitions of socialism. I told you they weren't the only three. This is a debate that's been going on inside socialism, and it's perfectly reasonable for me to give you those three. It might be nice for you if there was one you could cling to, but that's not the way it is. The tradition is too big, too broad, too global for there to be one definition, as there is.
And now he makes it a little more even murky as to, was that really his definition of socialism, right? Because he said when he was saying that third definition, like me. But now he's saying, I gave you three definitions, and he doesn't clear it up in saying that my definition was the third one. He just says, I gave you three definitions, and socialism has many definitions, and these are the ones that are operating, and it just so happens that if you don't like that, and it's not neat enough for you, well, then that's your tough luck. So he muddies the waters a little bit even more here by not being very clear in his definition of socialism. I don't know if he's doing it on purpose. It's hard to know. I do know that he is lecturing the shit out of Destiny here. You can tell he's a professor. I don't know if Destiny's looking at him. I don't know what he's looking at on his screen, but based off of Richard Wolff's like mannerisms and body language, he's starting to come off extremely condescending and like talking to Destiny as if he's a student.
Is in most interesting things in the world, and certainly in many large organizations and large traditions. I did give you my own. My own is focused on the transformation of the workplace. It's more interested in the micro transformation than in the macro ones, and particularly skeptical about the power of the government as having had some bad consequences. I want to learn from these early efforts to build socialism so that the future revolts against capitalism will have a better outcome than the ones that we've already had.
What is
they
capitalism?
achieved something. Let me finish. They achieved many things we want to hold on to, and they made some mistakes we want to avoid. And that's exactly what it means to learn from the past. Now let me address the question of capitalism. Here's what capitalism is not distinguished by, and therefore is not useful as a definition. Markets. Slavery has markets. It's a different economic system. Feudalism had markets for much of its history. That's not a definition of capitalism that's unique. Capitalism doesn't use.
This is where Destiny said markets before when he mentioned capitalism. Capitalism has markets, and I think private investment. And this is where Richard Wolff definitely could be a little more charitable. It's obvious. Maybe it's not obvious to him because he doesn't know Destiny that well, but he may not, probably doesn't see his content or anything like that. But Destiny he didn't actually mean like markets, just markets are what makes capitalism capitalism. Obviously, feudalism had markets, slavery had markets, socialism has more, obviously. I think Destiny starts to clear this up here, and Richard Wolff is just harping on the fact that he said markets make something capitalism. He's not being charitable enough.
Uniquely have markets. At silly, free or controlled markets, which is all we've ever had in the world, the controlled kind, are as old as Plato and Aristotle, who argued over markets. By the way, both of them opposed markets and thought they were socially destructive institutions, just for as a footnote you might be interested in. But capitalism is unique in one way. It's not a system that's unique in its markets. It's not a system that's unique in its quote-unquote free enterprises. Those are as old as Methuselah. But here is what's unique. Earlier systems, for example, slavery, organized the production of goods and services around a dichotomy, a slave and a master. The master owned all the equipment, all the means of production, and including the worker himself and herself. He owned them. And that was a very unusual way of organizing things, but it existed for a long time. Did it have markets? Often. Did it sometimes exist without markets? You bet. Then there's feudalism, radically different. No master, no slave. Nobody's anybody else's property. But you know how that works? You have a small group of lords at the top and a mass of serfs at the bottom. And the way the system works is that the serfs swear loyalty to the lord, and the lord in return to the serf. And the whole thing is sanctified in Europe by the Catholic Church.
Okay,
And then let me finish. Then comes capitalism. It's not a master and a slave.
I feel bad for having to put you through all this rambling, but it's actually important to the debate because he's just lecturing. He's not really like doing a good job of debating. He's just lecturing Destiny. It comes off he is a professor. It comes off, he's like professing, but it comes off condescending. It comes off as like he's trying to teach Destiny something he needs to be taught. And I would love to just be able to blow through this and cut it out and skip through it. But it actually is pretty important to getting the gist of how the debate went and how the conversation went. It also just, it actually is part and parcel of how Richard Wolff doesn't come off well, like doing this.
Slave, it's not a lord and a serf. It's a completely different arrangement. It's a contract. It's an employer and an employee. They don't swear anything to one another, and neither owns the other one. But they enter into a contract in which the employer says, I'm going to give you a wage at the end of the week. You're going to give me your brains and muscles for these hours of these days, and that's a deal we're going to make, and that's how we organize production. That's the distinction of capitalism.
No,
that's
it's
what
not.
I mean
That's
by
like,
capitalism.
no, you haven't given me a definition of capitalism at all. You told me a bunch of things that capitalism isn't, and then you've given me a bunch of random collected facts of history, but none of these things
Not at all.
Wait,
No, no,
absolutely.
I didn't do that.
For instance, when you talk about how markets aren't unique to capitalism, that's great. Worker management isn't unique to socialism. Worker management can exist under a capitalist system right now. I know that you like to talk about Mondragon a lot. Mondragon is...
Destiny says markets aren't unique to capitalism, and he's accurate, and he knew that in the beginning. But Richard Wolff was harping on the fact that he said the word markets as if markets were some sort of like key definition in defining what capitalism is, and they're not. But Richard Wolff maybe thought that that's what Destiny meant. He wasn't being charitable enough. He could have asked him, but instead of asking him, he just went flat out into professor mode and tried to teach him that capitalism isn't just markets. But Destiny already knew that. And he could have just asked Destiny to clarify or been a little more charitable to him, but instead he came off very professor-like and tried to teach him.
Let Destiny finish. We're going to go one at a time here, okay? So let Destiny finish and we'll continue.
When we talk about worker-managed firms or worker-managed co-ops, these things exist under capitalism. What are you saying then? Can I hold on real quick? I'm sorry. Can I get an explicit answer? He's answered within the last 50 years without going back into feudalism or what the Pope said or the schism of the Catholic Church. I want to know very concretely, without moralizing or loading anything, or without talking about something that happened in 1850, what is capitalism to you? Can you just tell me or explain what capitalism is? Because it sounds like, go ahead.
Any definition of anything is a process of separating it from that which it is not. That's all any definition ever was.
But we don't typically give definitions by naming every single thing that it's not.
Let him answer.
If you differentiate it from a cat, otherwise there's no way to do it. Differentiate and to give a
He is right. In any definition is you're differentiating it from what it is not. But that's not how we talk about it though. That's not how we actually express definitions to each other. It's not. When someone asks you to define what a refrigerator is, you're not you don't just start then defining what a car is and what an airplane is and what a microwave is and saying, well, it's not these things. Yeah, well, we know that. You've just wasted everyone's time. This is not how we actually talk.
definition of capitalism, you have to distinguish it from that which it is not. Those other systems didn't use an employer-employee relationship. That is the core distinguishing quality of capitalism. Slavery doesn't have that. Feudalism doesn't have that. And I never use the phrase worker management. Managers are not what we're talking about. Owning and operating. If you want to use a word, it's workers as their own boss, workers as their own board of directors. If you like, you can use the colloquialism in the United States that has existed throughout our history. A worker co-op, a cooperative, one worker, one vote, all decisions, majority vote. That doesn't exist in capitalism. That exists in a different relationship among the people at the workplace. Not slavery, not feudalism, and not employer-employee, because those are different people in each of those systems. Worker co-op, that's no longer the case. That's why it's a radically different socialist system, unlike any of the others.
How can you say that that's unlike any of the others when co-ops can exist today under capitalist economies?
Slavery can exist and did.
You're not answering my question. I don't want to the negative of everything I'm saying. You're saying today that this is a unique thing that exists.
There's never been a problem in any society of which we have historical record for different class structures, different systems to coexist. You're asking me a question as if it were, is this possible? It's never been anything other than the norm.
But you're telling me that in your society, or I could be wrong, you can correct me, but it sounds like in your society, you would exclusively like firms to be in the hands of workers, which would necessarily preclude.
Not at all. I've never said it. You're just attributing things to me.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm trying very hard to answer what you're saying. Your answers are very long-winded. You're not really answering my question. So am I to understand then that you are in favor of a society where workers have the option to vote on and have control over the workplace, but there's also room for private investment and the government intervenes in things like healthcare or education? Is this like the type of society you're aiming for?
My guess would be that the transition from capitalism to what I'm talking about would have long periods of time, typically, where these different class structures, these different systems coexist with one another.
Okay, that's what we have today.
No, you don't have it in anything like the way I want it.
Well, how do you want it? What's different from your vision what we have today?
Well, what we have today is predominantly capitalist with smatterings of the other. I'm interested in having predominantly socialist with smatterings of the other. That's the difference.
And without disallowing private investment or disallowing individual owners, how do you get there?
Private investment is a completely different matter. You can have private investment and worker co-ops.
How?
It exists. What's the problem?
Why would I ever invest in a company without gaining some amount of equity in the company? They have no obligation to return any profit. I would never invest in a co-op.
Why would you invest in in businesses in the United States?
Correct.
Let me finish. Hoping, for example, for something called a capital gain. Mm-hmm. You hope that if you buy the shares and if the company does real well.
Oh, this is where they get into the finally get into the meat of the whole worker co-op thing and private investment and how they can't coexist. They can't coexist. By definition, fundamentally, a worker co-op, if it has private investment from outside investors, is no longer a worker co-op. It can't be. And this is where Richard Wolff is just wrong. He's just dead wrong.
You will be able to sell the shares at some future point to another investor at a higher price.
Correct.
If that company's growth is the product of its worker co-op organization, you're perfectly happy if you can make an investment that grows over time.
But in your world, those shares don't exist.
First of all, these kinds of enterprises exist in the world. So this is not a hypothetical.
Then they're not worker co-ops by definition.
Sure.
A worker co-op. Okay, tell me, my definition might be incorrect, so you can correct me. My understanding is that what makes something a worker co-op, or what makes something employee-owned, is that the means of production or whatever firm you operate at is wholly owned and operated by the workers, meaning that when profits are generated by that company, they're returned to the workers, and when decisions are made about that company, those decisions are made by the workers. If that is the definition that we're going by, there is no room for private investment there.
Right, but that's the wrong definition and not the one that operates in the world.
Give me your definition.
The definition of a worker co-op is that the workers make the key decisions. They are their own board of directors. They may make the decision democratically to raise capital for their business by selling shares. Of course they could do that. Those shares would not allow the people who own them to do the steps that they can in capitalism. They would not, for example, be able to dictate who's the board of directors because the workers themselves are their own board of directors. But there's no problem with private investment. There never was.
And my question is, why?
There is a problem with private investment because if you're a worker co-op, your goal is to maximize the wages of the workers, and if you're a private investor, your goal is to get a return on your investment. Well, those goals don't align. The worker co-op is owned and managed by the workers. They have no obligation, nor is it their goal to return a a positive ROI to any private investor from the outside. And if it was, then they no longer would be a worker co-op. They would be beholden to the goals and whims of the private investor, of the capitalists. And then fundamentally, by definition, that means they're no longer a worker co-op.
Example. We have this definition. I just want to hone in on this definition. My question is, why would any individual ever invest in a company that doesn't have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors? So, for instance, in your world, if I would buy 20% of a co-op, their workers tomorrow could say, you know what, we're all bored. We don't want to do this anymore. We're going to move on. We're shutting the business down. And now I've just completely lost out on my investors. They have no responsibility to me because I have non-controlling shares. The only shares you're selling are non-controlling. Why would any private investment ever come in knowing that co-op never has an obligation to make a profit or return a dividend to the investors?
There's many companies listed on the stock exchange right now that pay no dividends to their investors. Here in the United States, it's a normal part of our
No, absolutely not. They might not pay.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about capital markets 101.
This is where, again, the misspeaking of words screws everything up. He says there are companies today on the stock exchange or whatever said that don't pay dividends to their shareholders, and then Destiny says no. So now Richard Wolff thinks that Destiny thinks the only way to return, or that you have to pay dividends to shareholders, that all companies have to pay dividends, which obviously isn't true and doesn't happen. And Richard Wolff thinks that Destiny thinks that every company on the New York Stock Exchange, for example, pays dividends. So the fact that he said dividends and Destiny just said no, they're confusing each other without actually realizing it.
They might not pay a dividend, but
then you're badly misinformed.
I promise you, the foundation of the stock market in the United States is a returning of capital to the people that are the ones doing the investment in companies. Now, it might be the case, as you correctly point out, absolutely. It might be the case.
Really. You're unaware. Most of the most dynamic companies in this country are selling stock to people to whom they have no responsibility, legal or otherwise, to give them a dividend ever.
Okay, Professor, do you believe that a dividend is the only way that you can return capital to shareholders?
That's not the point.
That absolutely is the point.
See, and now this is where Richard Wolff starts to begin to be uncharitable, because Destiny obviously misspoke before when he said dividend, and then Destiny said no, because now Destiny's clearing it up. He obviously is saying that there is other ways to return money to the shareholders. The share can just increase in value, and then you can turn around and sell it for a gain. Stock buybacks, the dividends. So there's other means to return money back to the shareholders. And Richard Wolff this is where he starts to be again uncharitable, because Destiny clearly understands that there's not just dividends to give back.
No, you made the point. What is the company responsible for? The company is responsible to run the company. They are not responsible to give money back, whether it's dividend, return of capital, or any other way, to the people who give them the money to buy shares. The people who give them the money are gambling. They hope that they can sell the shares for more, and they will sell the shares to anybody who can buy them. The company's not responsible to buy those shares. The company's not responsible for what price they can get. If they lose their share.
This is kind of accurate. There is no corporate law in the books that says that a company has to maximize profits for its shareholders. There is no law that states that. So he is correct in that regard. There is no actual law that says companies have to maximize profit for shareholders. What they have to do is they have to put the company's interest ahead of their own interest. That's one aspect that's literally written into law. And they have to They have to act in such a way that they obviously can't commit fraud, can't commit any kind of crimes like that, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, their employees. So while there's no actual word that says they have to maximize profits, but we know that how you run a business and the reason you're in business is to maximize profits. So knowing that they have to, then the reason they're in business is to maximize profits, everyone knows then that it's safe to invest in these companies because they're all trying to maximize profits, as opposed to a worker co-op, which is trying to maximize wages.
Tough luck. It's not an obligation or a responsible. That's the way the law of this country works for the stock market. And there's no problem in a worker co-op saying to investors, we're going to grow better than what you can get from a capitalist enterprise. So buying a share of our stock will give you a better shot to sell it at a higher price later. And I can give you examples.
Wait, I don't want examples.
There is no problem with them saying that. He is accurate. There's no problem with the worker co-op saying that. But then fundamentally, it would no longer be a worker co-op. If they sat down, if the owners and the workers, which are the worker co-op, sat down and started voting on the goals and whims of outside capitalist investors, they would no longer be a worker co-op. That is capitalism through and through. They would just be a corporation. They would no longer be voting in their own interest of the business and their wages. They're now voting to return money to the capitalist who invested in their company, who isn't a worker, doesn't manage it at all. This is capitalism.
No.
We don't need examples
I'm going
because
to give you an example of a company that did that, just so you can see why an investor would do it. I mean, really, you can make a theater of your hand.
I'm not making the problem. You said something that's just so on its face, absurdly incorrect.
And this is just complete waste of time. He starts again the whole professing thing, and let me give you an example. We don't need an example, like Richard. We don't need an example, Professor.
The characterization of U.S. capital markets. You do not agree that there exists a legally binding, the SEC legally regulates fiduciary responsibilities to investors. I don't like this trick you've pulled by making it sound. Let me finish. You've made it sound as though I believe the only way to return capital to shareholders is through dividends. That's absolutely not the case. That's one reading of it. You can return it via stock buybacks. You can return it via increase in growth of the company.
You're not obligated to do any of that.
You absolutely have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. Of course you do.
If you take my advice, I teach these courses. If you read what fiduciary responsibility means, it's an abstract generalization. It can be easily demonstrated in thousands of legal cases that there is no obligation of any material sort that they return money to the people who invest in them. It is perfectly okay to run your business as you think.
He is right about that. It is kind of like an abstract generalization, as we went over. There is nothing on corporate law that says they have to return like money to their shareholders. But again, we know that everyone is in business to profit, and the shareholders know that they're in business to profit. And so if you're going to run your business in accordance with the business's interest before your own, you're trying to maximize profits.
Think it should best be done, short of committing fraud or illegal activity, and that would apply in any system. The investor is taking a chance, buying your shares in the hopes of selling them at a higher price. It happens all the time, and it would be perfectly consistent with workers who run their own enterprises and are their own board of directors. That's not a problem. Never was. There's nothing inconsistent with private investment on the one hand and worker co-ops on the other. Now, if you have a worker co-op system, they might decide, because we have democracy now, that they don't want that they would like to be the owners as well as the board of directors of their own enterprise. That's possible. That would be one of the variations of worker co-op economic systems, just like we have variations.
So again, this is where the whole definition thing comes in again. Now he's saying, well, a worker co-op, they don't have to be owners. It could just be managed, and the owners could actually be private investors who are investing, and they're the owners, and then they just manage it. Well, then again, we're just arguing this is impossible to nail anything down, because you're constantly changing the definition of what socialism is. It's like a little bit of capitalism. It's a worker co-op that's managed and owned. It's a worker co-op that's just managed. It's a worker co-op that's just owned. It's the government owning the means of production. It's everything. It's capitalism with universal health care.
Of capitalist systems.
Can I ask you, so in a private business in the United States, if I invest my money in a business, a publicly traded business, if they were to cash out all that money, just close the business down and run, you're telling me that in the United States that company wouldn't be held liable for scamming its investors?
Absolutely. If that company had a good lawyer and showed that they made an honest effort to have a business, and then it didn't work out and they closed it down, the investor would have absolutely no standing.
Exactly. You're right. But you used a word there, an honest effort, and it's doing all the heavy lifting in that statement. Of course.
This is exactly accurate again. And not only did he just use the word a good faith or an honest effort, he also snuck in the word, or the two words, good lawyer, meaning that if they had a good lawyer that could get them off from any kind of criminal or fraudulent activity, then, yeah, of course they'd get away without being held criminally liable for closing up shop and taking everyone's money. So he snuck in good, honest effort and good lawyer.
You absolutely must show a court that you are making a good, this is part of your fiduciary responsibility. You are making a good faith effort to return money.
That's what the worker co-ops could easily do. We're making a good faith, honest effort to make a business. And that business requires us to do X, Y, and Z. And the private investor got nothing to do. That happens every day.
That's not what a worker co-op's maximizing for, though. A worker co-op, if by your definition, which is a democratically voted organization, is going to be trying to take into account what their members are voting for. They might not vote in the best interest of a shareholder. They might vote to do something completely different with a company.
That would be understood by the shareholder.
But that's my entire point.
That is the entire point. If they start voting in interest of the shareholders, they're no longer a worker co-op. They're just a corporation that sells shares that's publicly traded. This is the point.
Only the most naive shareholder in the United States believes that the company's decisions are intended to do the best for the shareholder. I can show you 50,000 legal cases in which that's not the case, and which it is contested in the courts, and you could have that in a worker.
That's right, and I can show you the Dow Jones, the Nasdaq, and the S&P 500. We could go to the UK and look at the FTSE 250, the FTSE 1, and I can show you histories of markets where companies do reliably over long periods of time return profits, whether in the form of dividends or the increase in your share price, to people that invest in those companies. I'm sure you can show me a lot of things that happen that are bad in capital markets where companies scam people, much as I can show you bad things that happen like famines under the USSR. But pointing out to a few bad actors does not clear up the problem of the fact that investing in a co-op where the workers have no obligation to return anything to an investor.
We're not talking about bad actors. You're inventing these things. We were talking about private investment and worker co-ops. You had made a statement that these somehow couldn't co-op.
He didn't invent those things. You did what Wolff said. Did elude to bad actors. He did. That is what he just said.
I can show you 50,000 legal cases in which that's not the case, and which it is contested in the courts, and you could have that in a worker.
That's right, and I can show you
as he just says, I can show you 50,000 cases in alluding to that these are bad actors committing crimes. There are 50,000 cases going to court because presumably they committed crimes. These are bad actors.
The Dow Jones, the Nasdaq, and the S&P 500. We could go to the UK and look at the FTSE 250, the FTSE 1, and I can show you histories of markets where companies do reliably over long periods of time return profits, whether in the form of dividends or the increase in your share price, to people that invest in those companies. I'm sure you can show me a lot of things that happen that are bad in capital markets where companies scam people, much as I can show you bad things that happen like famines under the USSR. But pointing out to a few bad actors does not clear up the problem of the fact that investing in a co-op where the workers have no obligation to return anything to an investor.
We're not talking about bad actors. You're inventing these things. We were talking about private investment and worker co-ops. You had made a statement that these somehow couldn't coexist. I'm explaining to you that there's not the slightest problem. You want to change the topic, that's very nice, but that's what the topic was. We weren't comparing goods and bad stories. We were explaining how and why private investment is not an either-or in relationship to worker co-ops. One of the fastest growing industries in Spain is something called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. It's a family of worker co-ops.
They're not even worker managed, though. I don't know if this isn't even good.
It is the seventh largest corporation in Spain.
It's a federation of corporations.
Excuse me?
It's a federation of corporations, and it's not even worker managed. That's just worker owned, and they have all the same exploitative problems. They go to South America for labor. They rely on contract labor. Chomsky has criticized the Mondragon thing for existing in a capitalist framework forever. And even if this was your go-to killer example, the Mondragon Federation of Co-ops exists under a capitalist framework.
Could I finish, or do you need to tell me about the Mondragon Corporation?
I didn't mean to interrupt your lecture. I'm sorry. Continue.
Sure you did. Come on. Who do you think you're kidding? The Mondragon Corporation has many parts. The biggest single part of it are a collection of worker co-ops. If this were the United States, we'd call it a holding company, which is a collection of subsidiaries that do a variety of things. It's very common in the United States, and it's very common in the world of worker co-ops to do that as well. The different divisions help each other. The co-ops support one another. That's how the Mondragon Corporation went from 6 people in 1956 to over 100,000 now. Most of the people in the Mondragon Corporation function within their members, about 200 companies, each of which has workers, one person, one vote, making democratic decisions. This company has been extraordinarily successful. It has outcompeted its capitalist competitors. That's how it became so large. That's how it becomes so successful as it has been. It has rules. It maximizes, because you raised that before, a variety of objectives. It is not focused exclusively on profits. The notion that profit is the bottom line is the very convenient economic nonsense, because profits go into the hands of the capitalists at the top. And of course they want the company to maximize profits because that's what they get. They don't maximize wages because that's what they don't get. Other people get that. If the other people ran the business, its objectives would not just be profit, but the well-being of those workers, the community's well-being, a whole lot of other objectives to maximize. And you'd have to choose among them. You wouldn't have the essential profit maximizing, which we teach in economics, without explaining to our students that by maximizing profit, the whole company's life is devoted to maximizing the return of a very small number of people within it. Okay, this is what has changed in a worker co-op. That's why it's so different from capitalism. Its decisions, investment, growth, distribution of income, all the big decisions would be made with a different set of objectives because a different set of people with different interests are making those decisions. For a society like ours that blabbers on about democracy, you'd think this was the most attractive possible way to proceed because it democratizes the economy by democratizing the enterprises at the core of that economy. Instead, we live in a society which pretends that you can have political democracy, even though in economics you have an autocracy, a tiny aristocracy running each enterprise, doing what it wants, maximizing the part of the output it gets, namely the profit, and therefore we get surprised that our political democracy doesn't work real well. Hello, that's because it's trying to sit on top of an economic system that is the opposite of democratic. The proposal of socialists is a proposal to extend democracy from the political realm to the economic realm. Why that is frightening to people who otherwise say they favor democracy, I find amazing.
I find it equally...
That whole rant was just extremely professor-like and condescending, and his body language, his movements, it was just terrible. It just came off looking awful. And it was completely unnecessary as well.
amazing that throughout this entire monologue, all you're advocating for are liberal markets with a little bit more government intervention. If you want to
Not
talk
at
about
all.
Mondragon, absolutely. If you want to talk about Mondragon, we can talk about Mondragon until we're both blue in the face. One, it's not worker managed, okay? It is just worker owned. A lot of the management that comes within a lot of the Mondragon Federation come from other workers, but they do not vote on all their policies or productions. That is absolutely not true. Number two, Mondragon does run itself for profit. That's why if you only change the means of production and not the mode of production, you are still producing commodities for a profit. Now, it happens in this case that the profit is going to the workers, but it still absolutely runs for a profit. That's why socialists point to it and say, look at how successful it is. Part of the reason why it's successful is the amazing revenues and profits that it returns to its workers that are generated. And then number three, Mondragon, in order to continue growing, one of the problems that Mondragon has started to face recently, and it's one of the reasons why it's criticized by people like Chomsky, is because it's had to continue to acquire more and more workers that do not get controlling shares, that don't have the ability to know what's going on. Mondragon also trades across markets, including going to places like South America and trading with exploited workers. So I don't think that Mondragon, and finally, Mondragon exists under a capitalist mode of economics. Like, Mondragon exists and interacts with other people within a capitalist economy, which I think is good. If Mondragon works and succeeds, that's awesome. I think it's cool. I like to see alternative types of business.
All of that is accurate. Everything that Destiny just said is accurate and true about Mondragon, minus the fact that he keeps pronouncing it wrong, and then Richard Wolff here corrects him, which is actually really funny.
To succeed. But I don't understand how you can talk about the successes of Mondragon and then say that, like, well, this is an example of the failures of capitalism when Mondragon exists and thrives right now under a capitalist framework, interacting with so many other capitalist sections of the economy and so many other capitalist countries in the world. My problem is that by moving more towards what you want, you would use government policy to necessarily disallow the types of private ownership or private investment that have been so important with other types of inventions or creations around the world. You can keep saying that I'm making stuff up, but at the end of the day, the problem that we're having. The problem we're having is the definition of socialism, and I notice that this is it seems to be a key problem with people that call themselves socialists, is your definition of socialism is so amorphous and morphing at any particular point in time. I still don't really have...
Well, you seem to be having trouble with it, but that doesn't make it amorphous.
It absolutely is amorphous. Even your definition of capital...
It is extremely unclear now, because in the very beginning, he gave the third definition, remember, and he said, like me, and then later he says that he wants co-ops to be worker-managed and worker-owned. But then he points to Mondragon as something that what he wants, but Mondragon isn't both worker-managed and worker-owned. So now it's like, what is your definition? Initially, you pointed to, you weren't very clear. You laid out three definitions, and in the third definition, you threw in the two words "like me," which could have easily been missed by Destiny or anyone listening. And then later on, and then in that definition, you say they're worker managed and worker owned, and then you point to an example of your definition, but that example isn't actually a full example of your definition, because Mondragon isn't worker managed and worker owned. So, yeah, like, what is your definition? It's extremely unclear at the moment.
Capitalism is absolutely amorphous. Where I hear...
Well, you're just not familiar with it.
I'm absolutely familiar with it. I absolutely am able to... If you would like to ask me for my definitions of any of these things, I would be glad to explain it. And you can tell me, you can correct me, Professor, if you think I'm incorrect in my understanding of things. But I believe that when I ask you to tell me, like, what is capitalism, what is socialism, and it feels like I'm listening to Trebek, read off the board in Jeopardy, I feel like that's damaging to the position that you're trying to explain, more so than me asking the question.
Yeah, well, let me correct you about Mondragon, which is, by the way, how it's pronounced. Mondragon has multiple parts. Some of the parts are the adjustments it's made to living in a capitalist world. That's absolutely correct. That would have to be any worker that forms.
The CIA has got Richard Wolff's Wi-Fi. They got his Wi-Fi. CIA.
Any worker co-op that forms now has to exist within a framework of a society that's organized differently. That's exactly the way it was when capitalism emerged out of feudalism. The early capitalist enterprises, towns, villages had to exist within a feudal framework. They had to come to terms with that. Some of them were able to do it. Others of them disappeared or were overthrown by feudalism until they got big enough and strong enough and learned from the mistakes of early experiments in capitalism how to set up a system that would be what it now is, the global system. I expect the socialists to kind of replicate that experience. Russia was an experiment. China's a better one. Cuba, Vietnam, and so on. They make efforts. They're learning what you do, what you don't do, what you replicate, what you avoid, and they will get eventually to the scale and sense of how to do it on a more global scale. That's how feudalism happened. That's how slavery happened. That's how capitalism happened. And it's reasonable to expect that's how socialism will happen. There is no simple definition of socialism that would be, to use your words, correct. No agency gives you out a license. This is correct. That one isn't. A tradition as lively, as global as socialism is always going to have different interpretations, different definitions that argue with one another. That's healthy. That's normal. There's nothing fuzzy or amorphous about it. The idea that you can have one definition is an authoritative and authoritarian notion that there isn't debate and contestation when there always is. My job was to give you three of the major definitions of socialism that contest in the world today, that are widely accepted. By everybody? Of course not. But those are the ones that are around, and it's reasonable to talk about the tradition in that way. Mondragon let me finish. Mondragon is an experiment, a very successful one. You can, if you like, attribute everything to capitalism that happens that's good, and attribute everything bad that happens to the absence of capitalism. This is very interesting, and that's really not very interesting. And I'm not going to get into that. I will tell you there are some remarkable things that Mondragon has done. Along the way, the majority of its workers voted the following rule: the best paid person in Mondragon cannot get more than 8 to 9 times what the least best paid person is. This was an attempt. I've been there. I've watched it.
It's just not true. So you're telling me that of all the employees in Mondragon, the highest paid employee.
That was a decision made by a large number of the worker co-ops that make that.
So you're telling me that the highest paid employee in Mondragon has a ratio of what they're.
Let me finish. In many of the component co-ops,
okay, that's correct.
It's a holding company of many co-ops. In many of those co-ops, I can't speak for everyone. This was a common.
That is correct. He corrected himself. It's not the whole confederation. It's within each individual co-op within that confederation. In the co-ops, I think the ratio is like 9 to 1 or something like that. But within the whole federation, it's actually very, very like hierarchical in terms of pay scale. And there are people who may be in one worker co-op and then another worker co-op that are in the entire confederation that their pay may be 15 times what the other one's is in a different co-op.
Rule. I went and spoke with them. I interrogated them about it. And that's what I discovered. They passed a rule after much debate at a maximum difference of 8 to 1. You know that corporate CEOs in this country get roughly, on average, 300 times what the lowest paid worker or even the average worker in their employee class.
What is the ratio? They
were able to do something about inequality. Wow, here they are, successful and growing. They're the 7th biggest corporation. They're the envy of most other corporations in Europe who cannot show such a history. But they were concerned not just to maximize profit, but to do something like limit the inequality that otherwise is so corrosive to societies like ours. And they were able to do that. That's an interesting quality. Thomas Piketty released a book in 2014 in which he demonstrates in 600 pages that every single capitalism we have a record of has built into it a tendency to ever greater inequality that is only periodically interrupted by revolts from below, like what we had in the 1930s in this country, which never are durable because once the revolt passes, the tendency of capitalism to inequality grows. That has always been an inspiration to socialists to advocate for a system that might have within it a built-in mechanism to at least reduce the inequality that haunts capitalism. And the reality is that Mondragon, and not only that, have demonstrated that there is a quality of worker co-ops that does, and effectively, a good job of addressing the inequality that otherwise haunts capitalism. And that would be an interesting way to understand why socialists would be drawn. They are not worker managed. The way a corporation works is there are 3 layers roughly. The employees who do most of the work, the managers who supervise the employees, and then another group of people to whom we give the name directors, the board of directors.
See, this is another one where it comes off extremely condescending. Like, why are you explaining to Destiny the layers of a corporation and how they work? And then he gets to it when he says directors, as if like they're dictators. It's like this is just condescending, coming off as he's talking to Destiny as a student that needs to be taught something. He's already commandeered. It's been an hour and he's probably talked for like close to more than 65% of the time, and it just doesn't come off well. Even if you win a debate and you're talking that much, it doesn't look good.
Shareholders elect the board of directors because they're the ones who receive legally the profits, and they decide what is to be produced, how it's to be produced, what technology to use, where the production happens, and what is done with the profits. The managers don't do that. So to talk about
gentlemen, we're coming up to the hour now. We have had a disproportionate amount of talking time, I think, by you, Professor Wolff. Well, at the same time, Destiny, would you want to give a closing statement to this as we're coming up? So I'll give you a couple minutes to respond.
I take issue. Sure. Yeah. Man, there's so many things. Citing, I just think it's incredibly disingenuous to open with Mondragon has 80,000 employees and they voted to have an 8 to 1 pay between owners and their or not owners, the highest paid employee and the lowest paid employee. But that's not true. You corrected yourself after I corrected you, which I'm grateful for. It's within the co-ops, within that federation. I'm willing to bet that if I were to ask you, you probably couldn't tell me what the highest paid employee within the Mondragon Federation is. What is the ratio of their pay to the lowest paid employee of the Mondragon Federation? Because it has an incredible vertical structure in terms of how it interacts with itself. Now, I could just as easily construct you a world where the ratio of pay between the CEO of Amazon or Walmart is much smaller, where the ratio closes between the lowest paid employee. If I create a Walmart or Amazon holding company and I simply split off all the managerial people or some sectors of that company into their own individual companies and break it up like that, the way the Mondragon has. Not to say that Mondragon has failed. Not to say that they have totally different sectors. They have. I'm not making this up. Everybody can go and look at how the company is structured. Everybody can go and look at the different types of things. They have grocery stores. They've got a financial sector.
All right. What other
yes, but they do not separate out their managers. They do not separate out one group of workers with high pay from others. That's a hustle. That would be a hustle.
I agree.
They do. They do, because it's a confederate. They have they've, like Destiny said, they have like a finance. They have grocery stores. These people are paid very differently within the finance co-op and like the grocery store co-op. So they do separate it out. They have different co-ops within the confederation. Within those co-ops, there has to be a ratio limit of the highest paid to the lowest paid within the co-op. But beyond the co-op, in the whole confederation, someone in the finance co-op can and does get paid more than 9-to-1 ratio of the lowest employee in the grocery store co-op.
You're
Would be a hustle.
asserting that Mondragon is just that's make believe.
Do you acknowledge that
the argument is so difficult that you have to make up the information to support it?
my argument is so concrete that I don't think I've had to bring up feudalism a single time to make any of my points or ask you any questions related to any of your points.
Your analysis a little richer than
So something I'm curious about. Why wouldn't you consider, just going by the incredibly generous definition you give me on point one of socialism, why wouldn't you consider the Democratic Party in the United States a socialist party? As a party that wants to see more stuff returned to Americans, wants to see people that greater control the workplace, had members that were pushing for 20% ownership in the share companies, Bernie Sanders.
You know what this is too. Here's what this is. This is why socialism is now like all these definitions, and it is what the Richard Wolff is like. It's a co-op, but it doesn't have to be owned and managed by the same people. It can just be managed. It's because it's been beaten back by capitalists. It's been their arguments for workers owning the means of production, which is like the original socialist definition. That argument of that stance is completely untenable. It's completely untenable. So capitalism has beaten back their arguments so far so that now they are basically just saying socialism is capitalism with worker managed co-ops. Because every other definition that they've had and that they're throwing at capitalists keep losing in arguments and losing in the real world. So it's been beaten back so far that now you're basically just saying, it's worker co-ops that are managed by the workers. This is like science beating back religion. It's God is Jesus, and you have theism, and then from after that gets beaten back, you have people that are just deists, and they're like, well, God isn't Jesus, and God isn't any one thing. There's some God out there, but it's more like who knows? It's a deism. I'm a deist, and then that gets beaten back to the point where they're like, well, maybe there is no God, but there's some sort of force out there, like some sort of unexplainable force in the universe that's kind of put things together. It's because that their argument keeps getting beaten back by science, so they keep getting pushed further and further away from their original definition.
The AOC. Why wouldn't you consider the Democratic Party in the United States a socialist party?
Because it opposes almost everything you just mentioned. It has a small wing now that is in favor of it, who, by the way, call themselves socialists. But the establishment of the Democratic Party, its history over the last 100 years, since Franklin
that's not
Roosevelt.
fair. Why would you talk about the history of it? That's not relevant.
Because history is always.
It's absolutely not relevant. You said yourself that the way that we look at socialism today is different than it was 100 years ago.
Joseph Biden is a product of that history, as he himself says. That party has been unable to make a government. They couldn't even preserve the level of government intervention that was achieved in the 1930s. The last 70 years have been a rollback of the New Deal, an undoing of it, and that was done as much by the Democratic Party as the Republicans. The Republicans pushed harder. The Democrats could not only not advance on what was achieved in the 1930s, they couldn't even preserve it. That's why we have an unemployment problem now and have had a terrible experience.
I think we have an unemployment. No, absolutely not. An unemployment problem.
The unemployment problem now is due to a 100-year pandemic that's blown through this country like a goddamn F5 tornado. I mean, it's a little rich to contribute that to capitalism.
Proposed a jobs program of the federal government the way it worked so well in the 1930s. You couldn't even have the courage to come up with what was already done. It's been a retreat. The Democratic Party has been a retreat from what it did before. All that AOC and Bernie are trying to do is to bring back the little bit of socialism that the last 75 years of the Democratic Party have been devoted to getting rid of. That's why they're so embarrassed, these political centrists, by the rise of the left. They thought it was over.
No, this is unimaginable analysis of political parties today in the United States. I don't think the closed shop policies that Biden are advocating for represent some walk back in policies. Or I don't think that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party push equally or even remotely similarly for the types of economies that they'd like to see today. Whether or not you have problems with how the Democratic Party functions, I don't know if your issues are with the Democratic Party or with the politicians that Americans elect. I know that it's a very popular pastime among lefties to demonize the Democratic Party for not being able to authoritarianly or totalitarianly rule the country, absent the other half of Congress. It seems like a lot of people on the left don't seem to understand how our government functions. I don't know if that includes you or not. I think just given
we have folks like you that will help us.
I guess we'll see.
Yes.
The thing that I've learned the most today, I'm happy to see that the Democratic Party, under definition one of socialism, I guess, is considered at least somewhat of a socialist party of view, as they are believers of enterprise and private capitalists. And I guess,
I just spoke against it. How you got out of that?
You started to.
because he did speak against it now, but in the beginning, when he gave his first definition in his list of 3 definitions, based on that definition, the Democratic Party and in the current day United States of America falls under that first definition. So that's why.
You started to appeal to things the Democratic Party has advocated for, or appeal to a history 100 years back. Like, okay.
We've turned into a Fox News channel. Let's slow it down. We're gonna get right to the audience Q&A. Okay. All right, so we have hundreds and hundreds of questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of them. I'm going to try and time both your responses to about 2 minutes, so I'll give you like a 10 to 15 second warning when you're coming up to that. So the first one is going to you, Destiny. What could convince you that your system or your defense of capitalism is wrong and that socialism is a better path forward?
I think seeing these things tried on a smaller level and having more success on larger and progressively larger levels would be convincing. The thing that oftentimes troubles me when people advocate for different economic systems is, much like Wolff has done and says, maybe he won't say he's done this, but the moralizing of like the relationship between an employee and employer, or the moralizing of different aspects of who owns the means of production or who works on the means of production. I'm not really interested in the relationship between a boss and a worker. What I'm more interested in are the material conditions of people at the end of the day. If different relationships are more beneficial to growing the economy rather than shrinking the economy but producing a quote-unquote better relationship, I'm more in favor of the former than the latter. I like capitalism because I think that having private enterprise adequately allocates capital into sectors of the economy that desperately need that capital allocated to it. I understand that Wolff is laughing because he's probably going to say something like, oh, well, what about healthcare and education? And I'm so glad that me and the rest of my liberal and even neoliberal friends agree that there are times when the government can step in and it can alleviate some of the problems that the free market doesn't address. For instance, capitalism doesn't solve well for things like healthcare or education, something that we desperately need to realize in the United States as we work to, I guess you could say, socialize those industries, which I'm so glad can happen in a capitalist framework.
All right, Professor Wolff, do you want to respond to any of that, or just get a direct question? And if you are going to respond, I'm going to just keep the timing to the 2-minute window.
No, I think this is rehashing stuff we went over. So how about another question?
All right, so for Professor Wolff, were a state to become socialist, how would it thrive within a hostile capitalist world without resorting to the authoritarianism and imperialism of 20th century socialism?
I find this sort of remarkable, these kinds of questions. Imperialism. The imperialism that we study as people who are interested in this topic is a product of capitalism. The subordination of the third world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, was a subordination organized and operated by capitalist institutions and capitalistically dominated societies. Imperialism, serious issue for sure, but it is a serious issue that is the product and the activity of capitalism. If you would like to talk about things the Soviet Union did and China has done in terms...
That's silly. Imperialism existed well before capitalism. You don't have to be a capitalist country to engage in any kind of imperialism or colonialism. It just so happens that the more recent imperialist nations and the nations that colonize other lands were capitalist. Before that, they were feudalists. Before that, they were, it was a slave and owner type of arrangement. Before that, they were tribal.
In terms of their activities in and around other countries, and you want to apply the term imperialism, fine, you'd have to make some adjustments because the logic was different and the outcomes were different, and the scale of it was utterly different. We didn't have, the Soviets and the Chinese, at least not yet, have not organized world wars to hold on and to expand their imperialist empires like World Wars I and II. So I find the whole question strange to put forward, especially without any explanation. And now to address briefly the question. What is state?
World War II, the Nazis and they weren't. Hitler wasn't doing what he was doing because of capitalism. He wasn't. So it's just so stupid. And China, if he still thinks China is any kind of bit of socialist, they are doing quite a bit of expansion in the South China Sea and in that area, and they just marched into Hong Kong, and they're threatening Taiwan. So, or are they not socialists? Is the word communist in their party? It's just a word. They're really state capitalists. Is that why now, because the capitalism that has come into China, is that's what's causing them to march into Hong Kong and threaten Taiwan and move into the South China Sea?
That became socialist would do depends on which of the 3 basic definitions I offered that state embraced. If it believed that socialism was what you have in Western Europe and Scandinavia, that's what it would do. It would have no problem. Excuse me?
Oh, we got 15 seconds left.
Okay. That's what it would do. If it followed the Soviet model, that's what it would do. And if it did the kind of thing that I'm advocating and the socialists like me do, then it would be devoted to changing the organization of enterprises by bringing democracy.
Oh, the CIA's got him.
Into enterprise inside capitalist enterprises.
Okay, to Destiny, do you think that Jeff Bezos works hundreds of thousands of times harder than his workers? Why should he be the richest person in the world?
You don't get compensated based on how hard you work. You get compensated based on the demand for your particular set of skills. There's probably less people that can work in the position that Bezos does than there are people that can work in any other more entry-level position at Amazon.
Wow.
Okay.
Wait, do you disagree with that? Do you think just as many people could handle being the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company as could handle being somebody that works in a grocery store?
Destiny is 100% accurate about that. He says, wow, because, again, he's trying to moralize that statement. It does sound morally reprehensible. It does. So he's trying to moralize it. But in actuality, that's true. That's what happens in capitalism. You don't get paid for how hard you work. You get paid for your skills, how the scarcity of your skills has a lot to do with how much you actually get paid. And it has little to do with how hard you actually work. And we see this play out time and time again. It's true.
Store or a fast food restaurant? Is there a simple yes or no to that, or am I about to get another lecture?
Well, you don't want an answer. You just want the answer you want. You don't want it in a form that
I'm sorry.
I would prefer.
Can I get an answer that doesn't involve feudalism?
That's not cute. Is that what the point is here?
Okay.
Why don't you just let me respond without coaching me on how to do it? Can we do that?
Okay, I'll give you 2 minutes. We'll go ahead.
Fine. The idea advanced by you earlier that you don't have one person walk away with $200 billion, roughly the estimate of Bezos' worth, and the vast majority of his employees unable to pay for their kids to go to college, is a distribution of the profits of that business that is morally reprehensible. That's how the wealth was accumulated, by the distributions of dividends to shares, share expansion and share improvement in value. We have a system that rewards one person with $200 billion and another one with $30,000. That's a remarkable decision to make in a community that calls itself democratic, or that likes to believe it wants to give people a fair and equal chance. No fairness here, no equality. It is revolting to me that anyone could find this reasonable. And to explain it by saying there's a demand, that's simply what the corporations give each other, the demand. They're the ones who create the demand, which they then fill.
This isn't true. While I do agree that it is morally reprehensible and it doesn't seem right, and we do need to devise better ways to redistribute this wealth, too much of it is getting in the hands of too few, but that it isn't just it is demand. It's demand for your skills, but it's also the scarcity of your skills, which is what Destiny said. There are less people that can do Jeff Bezos's job and have gotten to the point where he's gotten to. His skills are less available, therefore, and they're in high demand. Therefore, it drives up the wages that you have to pay in order to acquire his expertise, his skills. It's just this is just like basic econ stuff.
With themselves, because they're the ones who hire each other for that job. It's a remarkable self-serving system where the folks at the top give themselves as much as they can get away with. And if it were looked at that way, it would not survive 10 minutes.
Wait, what was the original question?
We were comparing how we understand.
Wait, hold on.
We were asking how we react to that inequality.
No, the question was why. I asked you, why do you think Bezos is compensated so much more than a frontline employee? Do you think that the demand for those talents is equal between somebody that could be a CEO versus somebody that could work in a supermarket?
I don't think the demand for that talent is an explanation of anything. You'd have to explain why the demand is what it is. Who makes the demand?
Sure, I can. Yeah, we can talk about all of that. I would imagine you as a professor should know the answer to all these questions, right? Where is the demand?
This is where you can see Destiny's finally kind of got fed up with Wolff's tone, his mannerisms, the way he's speaking, how he's lecturing to him, kind of talking to him like he's a student that needs to be taught something. Destiny's kind of, I guess, gotten to the point where he's got a little fed up about it. And Wolff should know these things. He does teach econ. Like I said, this is like basic econ stuff.
To running a multi-billion-dollar company that turns profits for people that you can explain all of these things. I don't know why you would pretend there's not answers. Very clear answers.
You can cast whatever aspersions you want on my qualification.
I'm not casting any aspersions on your
Let's
qualifications.
stick to Q&A. We have a few more to get through.
It's disappointing that instead of getting an actual answer to anything, it was all moralized. That's all we had. But okay.
Let's stick to the Q&A, okay?
Sure.
All right, final question to you, Professor Wolff. Under your system of worker cooperatives, would I still get my PlayStation 5?
Absolutely. You'd have to struggle a little bit for it. You'd have to talk to your fellow workers. You'd have to talk about the distribution of income. You'd have to compare your desire for PlayStation against all the other interests of all the other people. It wouldn't be something you worked out on your own with your particular boss in any way. It would have to be a democratic decision. You'd have to come to terms with that the way you do with democratic decisions now in our society to the extent that we have them. And I would like to add only that if Steve is interested, he could also look at the experience with COVID that the Cubans had, because it is in many ways even better than the ones that the Vietnamese had.
For the purposes of complete transparency, I'm just going to say that.
Count me out. If I had got to go through that many hoops to get a PS5, no thanks on the worker co-ops and the socialism. I will pass. That's going to wrap up this one. I'm going to go ahead and say that Destiny won this debate. Again, there were some point times where one of them would misspeak, and then the other one would take that portion of them misspeaking, and they would then attribute things to them that they could have been more charitable. Generally, that happened. Richard Wolff was doing it to Destiny. Wolff commandeered way too much at a time. He was talking down to him as if he was one of his students. He was professing a lot to him and going off on tangents and explaining things that were just a complete waste of time. And the whole point of where they finally got into worker co-ops, and if you would allow private investors to invest in a worker co-op, and the worker co-ops would then start voting in the interest of the private investor, that no longer makes it a worker co-op.